A Life of Smoke and Silvered Glass, a Harry Potter fanfiction written by E.Jade Lomax on Archive of Our Own as Dirge Without Music. Part 4 of 6, read by Grant Goodwin. The second time Severus ever saw Harry, the kid was stepping through the great hall doors in a crowd of tiny first years. They got smaller every year, Severus swore. Harry wasn't saying anything to the first years talking beside him, his head tipped back to look at the ceiling sky. He looked even more like James than he had the last time Severus had seen him, which made sense, because now he could walk, and presumably talk, and likely didn't chew on his toes so much. Severus wasn't sure how to feel about it, so he decided it didn't matter. Instead he peered down the long aisle at the kid, uncomfortable in new robes. He remembered how Lily had wrinkled her nose at those, standing near a kid who looked like he was probably the latest Weasley. Of course. The entire hall held its breath as Harry went under the hat, which Severus thought was fairly rude. Give the kid some sort of complex, would you? And how were the rest of the children supposed to feel about this? Gryffindor! The table of raucous hellions cheered and hollered. Severus fiddled with his fork sourly. Of course. Well, this will be an interesting year, Flitwick said cheerfully beside him. Yes, said Severus. He was looking over Quirrell's shoulder at Harry as he made his way to the cheering table of gold and red. When the boy turned to look up at him, 11, he was 11. Had he and Lily ever been that small? Severus saw him flinch. He frowned and turned back to his plate. Severus watched him carefully over the next few weeks, because he watched them all carefully. He weighed his options and decided ignoring Harry in class was probably the best answer. He did take 10 points from Gryffindor over Harry's missing tie, and heard the Weasley boy next to him hiss, He's got a soup stain on his robes from last week. What right? Another 10, I think, Mr. Weasley, he said, and the Granger girl beside them kicked at Weasley under the table. That could have been another handful of docked points, but he thought she was rather justified. The new defense against the dark arts teacher stunk of dark magic. DADA professors often did, of course. It was a matter of course that defending against dark magic would get some of it on you, and also there was the matter of the curse on the position. But there was something almost familiar about Quirrell, and Severus spent the beginning of the year making sure his shields were up and his face was right, trying to figure out exactly what tragedy the DADA curse was dragging into the school this year. Dumbledore had also told him he was keeping an immortality-causing magical object in a third-floor corridor, so Severus had additionally spent several sleepless nights over that. You're keeping that thing in a school? With children? Severus had demanded, pacing Dumbledore's office. You know exactly who's going to want that stone most. You know exactly who, Albus. If you're putting bait in the middle of this school, I will make your vocal cords constrict such that you speak an octave higher for a week. That could be an adventure. I hate you sometimes, he'd said. Albus, what are you doing? It is not bait, Severus. This is simply the safest place I have for the stone, and Nicholas asked me a favour. I'd like to ask your help with its defense. Severus had sighed. I'll come up with something. Severus thought of Petunia Evans Dursley as Toonie, because that was what Lily had called her in stories. Standing in the kitchen with Lily, a lifetime ago, he couldn't have imagined that Toonie could hate a child for years, just because he was a reminder of all the things she couldn't have. But that old kitchen was gone now, the Evans house boarded up and sold, and Harry was skinny for 11, knobbly-kneed and untrusting. When Severus looked at Harry, he did not see James. He did not see Lily. He saw a half-blood boy from an ugly home, and his heart turned to static in his chest. You could be better than this, he thought, when he saw Harry unflinching, when he saw his rigid shoulders in the Hogwarts halls. You should have been better than this. Toonie, she thought you were going to save the world. Dumbledore had told him about the protections in Harry's blood, the rules and sacrifices they worked under, but he wasn't sure that this was worth this. Severus didn't see James when he looked at Harry, or he tried not to, but he saw James when he looked at Fred and George Weasley. He saw James and he saw Sirius, and he gave them detentions for every careless thing they attempted in his orbit. In the weeks before Halloween, all the leaves died. As a child, it had been one of Severus's favourite seasons. The autumn, the fall, because Lily had worn oversized scarves and caps, and held his hand through bulky mittens, and kicked at the dry leaves. She had liked the noise they made, skittering over the concrete walks outside her house. Lily had called them the changing seasons, spring and fall, and she had liked that their names were verbs. Severus thought about that in those long months of the fall. For Halloween every year, Severus nursed his pumpkin juice and fed Agatha where she skulked on the back of his chair. McGonagall got stiff around Halloween every year, snapping at Severus in staff meetings and ignoring him in hallways. He was rather sure he knew who she thought he was mourning on rainy October days. Her sharp silences meant he was doing this right, he was certain. It was a victory. He tried to feel smug. He fed Agatha a bit of pastry. "Troll!" Quirrell burst through the hall's doors, and Severus snapped up his head, feeling like the muscles of his neck were fighting molasses instead of just air and gravity. "Troll in the dungeons!" The prefects rounded up the first years, herding them back to the dormitories like anxious, pimply sheepdogs. Severus thought that was Harry-handled, so he whisked away to protect the second most important thing in the castle. But of course, it was James's son. It was Lily's son. So while Severus was guarding the stone and getting his leg ripped open by Hagrid's three-headed monster pet, Harry faced down a mountain troll in a girl's bathroom. Once the troll had been dispatched and all the 11-year-old children had been sent off to bed, Severus climbed up to Dumbledore's rooms and spent a few hours nursing a fire whiskey and moaning about how foolhardiness was hereditary. But over the next few weeks, Severus watched Harry bobbing through crowds at Hermione's elbow, or Ron's, saw the way they leaned close and stood close, and rolled their eyes at each other. There were some things that were worth even staring down a 12-foot mountain troll, and that friendship was one of them. "The Longbottom kid?" Severus asked in the teacher's lounge when there was no one around but Professor Sprout. "How's he doing in your class?" "Green thumb." "I thought maybe," said Severus. "He sucks in mine, but I think it's approach, not ability. I should probably do something about it." Sprout buttered her toast in peaceable agreement. "If I call him in for tutoring, I think he'll die of fear, though." "I'll tell him I asked it of you, as a favour," said Sprout, "and that you're terrified of my wrath, and therefore will be on your best behaviour." "I am terrified of you," said Severus. "Why, thank you, sweetheart." Christmas brimmed anxiously on the horizon. He heard Harry telling the youngest Weasley boy in the class that last year he'd gotten a clothes hanger and a stale biscuit. Severus bought Agatha the plumpest mouse he could find, and Albus some socks, and then he dragged James's invisibility cloak out from the bottom of his closet. He'd last used it to drop some belladonna in a Death Eater's nighttime tea, which he figured was about as noble a purpose as something could have. He folded the silky silver fabric on his desk, and then he conjured some wrapping paper. He didn't know what James had used the cloak for as a child, but Severus remembered being 7 and curled under his blankets and hungry, too scared to sneak out to the kitchen because his father was snoring on the couch. "Your father left this in my possession before he died," he wrote. "Use it well." Severus thought maybe if he had been a different person, he might have talked to Lily in his head. "Hey Lily, today I ate a grapefruit, and you're right, they're disgusting. Hey Lily, it's been raining for weeks, but today I saw some kids up at the owlery trying to give every owl there an umbrella spell. Hey Lily, I miss you." But he had never talked to Lily because he had had things he wanted to say. He had made her flowers from leaves. He had told her about the birthday parties of 86-year-olds because he hadn't wanted to talk about other things. He had wanted to hear about her day and how she was doing and what idiot thing James had done recently. Who was Remus knitting a sweater for? Had Alice gotten tired of charming the breakfast toast dance? He wanted to talk to Lily because he wanted to hear Lily, what she wanted to share and what she wanted to say. So when the irises came back up in spring, he didn't tell her. When he cornered Quirrell in the Forbidden Forest, he didn't tell her. He just hissed threats in the wooded shadows and missed Harry eavesdropping from the branches. When Neville managed his first potion without a burn, a boil-over, or any billows of poisonous gases, he told the boy, "Acceptable, Longbottom," and he told Lily nothing. Her son took to the skies above the Quidditch pitch, and Severus had never seen the kid look so at peace. He didn't think, "Lily, look." He thought Quirrell was a minion, some glory seeker or blackmail victim trying to track down the stone. To be fair, Albus assumed the same thing, but Severus was still furious when he found at the end of the year that Tom Riddle had been hitching a ride into Hogwarts classrooms. He had kept in character all year, towering and hissing over the stuttering man. He had warned Quirrell away from the third-floor corridor with threats and flashing black eyes, like he had wanted it for himself, like there was some master he dreamed of serving it up to. If he ever saw Tom in person again, he could drop to his knees in shock and regret. "I thought I was protecting your interests, my lord. I didn't realize. If you had just told me—" Of course, Harry too had spotted his torn-open leg after stopping Quirrell from getting past Fluffy, had heard him hissing bile and threats at Quirrell out in the forest, but that was how it was supposed to go after all. Harry watched him balefully in the hallways, and Severus named it victory. It was a victory. It had to be. This was what he had. Severus had been asleep in his rooms when Harry, Ron, and Hermione petrified Neville, fought past the protections of a half-dozen Hogwarts professors, and finally faced down the fragment of Voldemort that was living on the back of Quirrell's skull. Dumbledore told him about it later, and Severus sank down with his face in his tired hands. "Well," he said, "he's certainly theirs, isn't he? Oh God, he's going to die." The next year, Narcissa's kid bought his way onto the Quidditch team. He was very little like his mother, except for the hair and the bone structure, and the excellent ability to turn his nose up at things. But Narcissa had moved through Hogwarts with a spine of exquisite steel. She had known who she was and what she wanted, and she would have ground herself down to the bone to get it. Draco wanted things, but he didn't know what he was doing. He parroted his father's words and not his mother's, and Severus wondered when the kid would find out where the power in his family lay. That year, Severus taught Harry Expelliarmus from a dueling club stage. He brought Polyjuice Potion up in class, and Hermione stole the supplies from his stores. All around them, students fell, frozen and rigid, lining the infirmary beds. Sprout hovered over her mandrakes, and Severus spent most of that year down in his dungeons, brewing ineffective practice drafts with mandrake substitutes. Dumbledore told him it had been Voldemort, after. He tucked the destroyed diary into the vault behind his desk, and told Severus about Tom Riddle, 16 years old, already a killer of children. "How many more are there?" Severus asked, looking at the painting above Dumbledore's desk, and thinking about the Horcrux lying dead behind it. "There's no way to know," said Dumbledore. "But he is a traditionalist. I think there will be 7. "Lovely," said Severus. "Just lovely." Dumbledore nodded, seated at his desk with his shoulders bowed, like he was old, like he had seen this all before. "Do you want to come down to the greenhouses for some tea?" Professor Sprout asked the day the students boarded the trains for home, when she found Severus nodded off in the staff room. He squinted down at his own cold cup of tea, but she kept patiently smiling down at him, so he gripped the mug and followed her down to the big glass houses. "You know Aguamensi, of course," she said, after she'd made them both big steaming mugs and set them to floating beside them. "That bush needs about 3 gallons. This little fellow here needs about 1. Severus lifted his wand obediently. He had watered the hedge behind the Evanses' house sometimes, but it hadn't been with a hose. Sprout hummed a little tune and started going through the foliage, tisking over brown leaves. "The littlest Weasley," he said. "Yes," said Sprout. "Oh, honey, no, you can't grow that way. Respect your neighbours. If you could keep an eye on her next year, a hand if she needs it." "Why don't you?" said Sprout. "Do you know what happened to her?" he said, instead of answering. Sprout was half inside a bush now. "I saw the writing on the wall, and know her brother and the Potter boy got her out. Gilderoy too, I suppose, though I doubt he was much help, poor lad. She must have been terrified." 11, Severus thought. God, they get smaller every year. "The thing that opened the chamber," Severus said. "The air. It was bothering her all year," he said. "In her head. In a haunting, sort of." Through the warped greenhouse glass the sky was a fierce and terrible blue. Tom Riddle had been creeping through Severus's school all year again, and he hadn't known. "I know some of what it's like," he said, "to have that man walking around your head, touching your best things, whispering. She just might need someone, when she comes back." "Well, I'm always around," said Sprout. "The greenhouses are good for escaping whispers." Severus couldn't quite figure out how to say thank you, so he hung around in the warm silence of the place, and helped her water the garden beds. Even professors couldn't apparate onto Hogwarts grounds. At the beginning of the next school year, Severus hunched his shoulders and trekked past drifting dementors at the gates. It was like the wettest days of October, the worst frosts of January. Cold grabbed him by the bone marrow and dragged him down, and so he set his jaw and walked up the gravel path. It wasn't like it was a big deal anyway. People said they could hear things sometimes, when Dementors came too close, that they could step back into the worst inhales of their lives and drown there. Severus pulled his cloak more firmly around his shoulders. All he could hear was a radio, flicked on to empty airwaves. All he could hear was the wind. He shoved past the first row of hedges on the grounds, and the Dementors faded behind him. The cold stayed. That third year, the Granger girl got a pet monster cat, and had played tag with Agatha in the great hall, going screaming down the aisles between the tables and terrifying the first years. Agatha seemed to be enjoying herself, though, so he let it be. Remus Lupin joined the Hogwarts faculty, and it was peculiar. Some days Severus didn't feel much older than 16, uncertain and raw. Some days he felt older than Dumbledore, intimate with the way those skinny shoulders hunched and knotted. But with Lupin standing there in these same old sacred halls, it was easy to see where they were. Lupin's visage was as threadbare as his clothes. You had always been able to see his bony elbows, even when he was the sensible shadow over Potter and Black's shoulder, the ballast against their worst ideas, except when he was Black's worst idea. Severus had sulked in Dumbledore's office when he heard the news. What about full moons? You'll make him the wolfsbane potion, Dumbledore had said easily, and Severus had sunk down in his chair and sulked more. I should get a raise. It tastes worse cold, Severus said, putting the steaming mug down on the desk on the first full moon day. If you want to wait. Thank you, said Lupin, as Severus stalked out of the room. Severus lurked around Madame Pomfrey after the students' first meal, during which Draco had loudly acted out Harry's supposed fainting on the train. What do you prescribe to students with bad reactions to Dementors? He asked. Is it a potion? I've never come across them in my studies. Oh, nothing so fancy as that, she said. A bit of chocolate and a warm place to sit is often the best medicine. She straightened beds and told him how the nice new professor had handed out chocolate to his cabin of third years. Potter hardly looked shaken for someone so badly affected, she said. But I suppose I'm used to seeing the lad in more terrible straits. Regrowing bones, that sort of thing. Said Severus, and stole a lollipop from the jar on her desk. It was Halloween and the children were celebrating excess desserts at dinner, and Lupin was drawing nonsense designs in his gravy, with slow drags of his fork. Wasn't she your friend once? Lupin asked. He asked it like he was curious, like he was kind. Wasn't Black yours? Said Severus. We all make sore decisions. Pass the potatoes, would you? He went back to sipping his pumpkin juice, and Lupin stopped asking him questions Severus couldn't answer. The Weasley twins still reminded Severus of Potter and Black, up to how they vanished and reappeared without notice, like the way you could never get rid of glitter, or that stain in the Cat in the Hat books. But Severus was fairly sure Harry wasn't lending them James's old invisibility cloak, because after all, they had been this annoying before he'd given the cloak up to Harry's possession. They had something more up their sleeve, it seemed, and whatever it was, they taught it to Harry, because the boy started vanishing, and then floating up to the surface like a bad egg in places he wasn't allowed. Harry wasn't allowed out to Hogsmeade, with Black on the loose, but Severus was pretty sure the boy was sneaking out there anyway. He found him in the castle with his pockets full of Zonko's toys and tricks, and as Harry stood in front of him, mulish and stubborn, Severus remembered James, bold and arrogant at school, remembered Harry's small soft weight on his chest as he carried him out of a home Sirius Black had betrayed. In among the detritus, Harry had an old piece of parchment, folded with care. Severus assumed it was another Zonko toy, until he jabbed it with his wand, and saw ink spread across its surface. He didn't know the nicknames because they had been their own, but he knew that heavy script. Mr. Prongs agrees with Mr. Mooney, and would like to add that Professor Snape is an ugly git. It's clearly from Zonko, said Lupin, when he appeared and got between Harry and Severus's rigid shoulders. He was smiling, with his scarred face and his hands closing over the parchment, and Severus let him do it. Whatever it was, this remnant haunted by James's hand probably belonged to Remus. The year rolled on. On a frozen February morning, Severus gave 50 points to Slytherin for Crabbe having his tie on straight, and heard a familiar voice behind him. Still favouring Slytherin, I see, said Lupin. I don't think Slytherin was the word you meant there, Severus said. Old loyalties die hard, as I'm sure you know. And on his next walk to class he took 55 points from a Gryffindor for whistling out of tune. On full moon days, Albus asked Severus to take over Lupin's classes. Severus stalked into the classroom, threw up page numbers on the board, and sat with his boots up on Lupin's desk. Said Granger. We're not there in the book yet. Does it seem like I care? Severus said. This is... She flipped through the book. It starts in the section on blood poisons, and then goes into a chapter on illusion magic. Did you choose these on purpose? Obviously, said Severus. 10 inches on how the two subjects affect each other. They don't, said Granger. 10 points from Gryffindor, Miss Granger, said Severus, and tipped his head back and thought about how best to brew dragonbone extract for the rest of class. The last full moon of the school year came, but when Severus went to bring Lupin his potion, he was gone. The parchment left unfolded on his desk was no longer blank, with ink moving and squirming on the page. Severus would have remembered Lupin's potion, steaming on the cluttered desk, any other day, but he saw Black's name on the map, and all he could think was, Lily. All he could think was, you promised you would keep her safe. He knew the way through the grounds to the Whomping Willow and the knot at its trunk that would freeze its violent thrashing for a time. He felt frozen, violence stretching before and behind him. He knew these dark little stunted passages. He remembered being 16 and jealous and petty, looking for a secret at the end of this buried corridor, and finding a snarling, aching monster instead. James had come for him, and Severus hadn't known what to do with that then, other than gamble on taking his hand and running. They had run, and Lupin had apologized later, tight-wound and furious, and Severus had regretfully not taken Lily up on her offer to punch Sirius Black in his handsome nose. They had run, and Severus was moving now, through that same musty dark. James's hair had been wild, his mouth tight and unsmiling, his hand outstretched. They had both been so rarely unsmiling, Lily, James, always either laughing or incandescent, furious, blinding, and maybe that had changed in the long, cold days of the war, but his trenches had been so far from their warm foxholes. Had Lily gone still? Had James gone quiet, turned to bedrock and frost? Severus had been lifetimes away from them, pretending to become something he hated. He had not been there to see them break apart, in those ends of days, in those days they did not know were the end. Lifetimes away, listening to the crackle of voices late at night. It felt like Lily had been dead for lifetimes now. James had risked his life for Severus once, because the man at the end of this corridor had thought it would be funny. James was dead, because this man had betrayed him. Lily was dead. What here was mischief? What was cold malice? What was cowardice? When Severus burst through the door to the shrieking shack, he had an Avada Kedavra on his tongue, ready. He had been more certain of few things in his life than that he had enough hatred in him to cast it. But apparently 3 simultaneous Expelliarmuses, even cast only by some third-year wizards, can knock a man unconscious. Severus didn't hear what came after, but he would have understood. I would have died rather than betray Lily and James, Black screamed at Pettigrew in that shack. I would have died rather than betray my friends. But Severus didn't hear it. He was unconscious through Black's story, through Pettigrew squealing, through Harry standing with frightened, certain fists and saying, "My dad wouldn't have wanted you to," like he knew anything at all about what James would have wanted. Severus didn't hear any of it, but he would have understood. He would have understood Black screaming in Pettigrew's face, 13 years, gaunt and hollow-cheeked. He would have understood the way Harry's stubborn face froze them in their tracks. Severus had walked through the long dark corridor, a killing curse roiling in his gut, and he didn't know, but Black would have understood that too. Severus woke cold and damp, his nose squished into mossy pebbles. Lupin was gone. Granger, Weasley, Black and Harry were strewn around him, under the fog crawling in off the water's surface. "The hell?" mumbled Severus, and then he conjured stretchers for the children and the ministry for Black. He was cold and he was aching, the fire out in his gut, and he thought maybe Black deserved Azkaban's long, slow torture more than a clean death. Severus wasn't sure what the kids had been thinking. He couldn't imagine what Black could have told them. What had Lupin said? What had he been thinking? Where was he? Hell, the potion. He levitated each of them onto the conjured stretchers, their dangling limbs, Ron's cast, Granger's bush of hair, the way Harry's slipped across his scarred forehead. Severus had never seen Harry without a scar. Screaming in his nursery, heavy on his chest with Albus thin and tired at his front door, Harry had always had a lightning storm writ into him, healed over and scarred. It had never gotten to be a wound. Severus got them to the infirmary, and then he hovered around the edges of the gathered Aurors and ministry officials, so he was there when the ruckus started off. Black was gone. Black was gone, and so was Hagrid's hippogriff of all things, though Severus didn't point that out to the Aurors. Harry was looking smug, like James at his worst, and Severus stormed up to Dumbledore's office while the kids got on the trains home. "You cannot let them do this," Severus said. Said Dumbledore. "Lemon drop?" "Trust Black," said Severus. "Albus, he got James and Lily killed." "Not mentioning Pettigrew and the dozen muggles, I see," Dumbledore said. "Don't you tell me what to care about," Severus snapped. "I am caring about Harry, and I know you. Why did you let this happen? I know they helped him get away, on Hagrid's giant angry bird." "You're one to talk about angry birds." "Albus!" Dumbledore sighed. It wasn't serious. There was a rush in Severus's ears, and he tried to bat it down. "It was," he said. "He was their secret keeper, because you wouldn't let them choose me." They swapped at the last moment, without telling anyone. They thought Sirius would be too obvious, so they asked Peter. "Pettigrew?" said Severus. "That wet paper bag of a person? They thought it would be safer. Sirius knew, of course, and he hunted down Pettigrew after they died. Peter was the one who killed all those people, and took off his own finger." Severus lifted a hand, shaking his head. "Pettigrew," he said. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Do you know if he's alive?" said Severus. "Alive, and I fear rejoining Voldemort as we speak." "He'll be easy to find then." "Severus," Dumbledore said sternly, "do nothing rash. We need you." "When have I ever been rash?" said Severus. He didn't hunt down Peter that summer and roast him over hot coals. He considered it, at length and with much imagined detail, but instead he went on a long backpacking trip through the Alps, seeking brewing ingredients that only bloomed under certain moonlights. Albus was right. Harry was the priority, and that meant Severus keeping his cover. But Severus had a list, and Peter was on it. He tucked it away in his mind. His life had not so changed that he had the luxury of being able to write such things down. In Harry's 4th year of school, the Goblet of Fire chose him as a frankly illegal second Hogwarts champion. "But what about sportsmanship?" Severus asked Dumbledore dryly. "What about the kid not dying before he figures out how to brush his hair?" End of Part 4 of 6. This has been a reading of a fanfiction creation by E.Jade Lomax, with music by Maiden.